Hello, I'm Peter Miller. I'm so glad you could join me for tonight's journey. Right now, as my voice settles into the quiet space around you, I want you to unburden yourself. Let your shoulders drop. Release the tension of being the steady one, the provider, the parent, the grown-up who holds everything together. For the next hour, you don't need to carry that weight. Leave the modern world behind. No memory foam, no double-paned windows. Just you drifting back to when staying warm meant staying alive. Notice the softness beneath you right now. That safety, that guaranteed heat. It was once a battle fought every single night. In the frozen forests of the Eastern Front or the snow-choked woods of the Ardennes, young men lay down with no promise of morning. They faced bullets and bombs, yes, but they also faced an enemy older and more patient than any human army, the cold itself. And against such a relentless enemy, we tend to believe a comfortable lie. The lie that survival depends on having the best gear, the newest technology, the thickest sleeping bag. But tonight we are going to dismantle that lie, because in 1941, relying on equipment alone would have gotten you killed. The soldiers who survived the coldest winters of the 20th century didn't make it because they had better gear. Most had terrible gear. They survived because they understood something we have forgotten. They understood that keeping warm isn't about what you buy. It's about physics. It's about the quiet, unglamorous courage to adapt when the world turns to ice. So settle in. Pull the covers up a little higher and let that weight remind you of what a gift warmth is. Let's go back to the foxholes where a generation learned a simple, brutal truth that comfort is a luxury, but refusing to freeze is an art. And that, in the end, was enough. The sleeping bag, that essential piece of camping equipment we take for granted today, the thing you unroll, crawl into, zip up, and trust to keep you warm through the night. It seems so fundamental, so obvious that it's hard to imagine sleeping outdoors without one. But here's what most people don't know. The sleeping bag, as we understand it, nearly didn't make it through World War II. And the soldiers who relied on them learned the hard way that sometimes having gear can be worse than having nothing at all. Let me take you to the Eastern Front first. Winter of 1941. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, was supposed to be over before the snow fell. The German High Command, relying on weather predictions that turned out to be catastrophically wrong, equipped their armies for a summer campaign. They expected to be in Moscow by autumn, the war in the East effectively won. When the predictions failed, when the coldest winter in decades descended on the Russian steppe, the Wehrmacht was caught with summer uniforms and almost no winter equipment. The sleeping bags they did have, the ones issued to mountain troops or special units, were based on a design that made perfect sense in a peacetime Alpine camp, and almost no sense at all in a mobile war. They were heavy. Not just heavy, but absurdly so. A German mountain sleeping bag fully stuffed with wool batting could weigh 15 pounds or more. For a soldier already carrying a rifle, ammunition rations, entrenching tool gas mask, and personal kit, 15 pounds was the difference between being able to march 20 miles and collapsing after 10. And that weight came with a promise. The promise that if you carried this burden all day, if you accepted the ache in your shoulders and the exhaustion in your legs, then at night you would be warm. That was the deal. Sacrifice mobility for comfort. But the cold had other plans. Because the second problem with those sleeping bags was that they absorbed moisture. Wool batting, for all its insulating properties when dry, becomes almost useless when wet. And in the chaos of a winter campaign, everything gets wet. Snow melts on contact with your body heat. Sweat from the day's march soaks into the fabric. Condensation from your breath freezes on the outside and melts on the inside. Within a few days, that 15-pound sleeping bag could weigh 25 pounds and provide less warmth than a thin wool blanket. The German soldiers discovered this in the most brutal way possible. They would carry these bags for weeks through retreat after retreat, guarding them jealously because they represented the promise of warmth. And then, when they finally had a chance to use them, when they crawled inside after a day of fighting in sub-zero temperatures, they would find themselves shivering uncontrollably within an hour. The bag was so cold, so damp that it actually pulled heat away from their bodies faster than they could produce it. Some of them died in their sleeping bags, not from bullets or shrapnel, but from hypothermia, wrapped in the very equipment that was supposed to save them. There's a passage in a German soldier's diary from December 1941, found after the war in the archives. He writes about finding a comrade frozen in his sleeping bag one morning, face peaceful, hands still tucked inside. The soldier was a veteran, careful and experienced. He'd done everything right. He'd found shelter in a destroyed building. He'd eaten his rations. He'd crawled into his sleeping bag before sunset to trap what body heat he still had. But the bag was wet from 3 days of marching through snow, and once the shivering stopped, once his body gave up trying to generate heat, the cold simply came in and took him. The diary entry ends with a single sentence that I've never been able to forget. We left his bag behind. No one wanted to carry it. Think about that for a moment. These were men desperate for warmth, facing temperatures that would kill them without protection. And they abandoned a sleeping bag because they understood with a clarity born of pure survival necessity that it wasn't going to save them, that carrying it would only slow them down, that the weight and the false promise were more dangerous than having nothing at all. This wasn't cowardice or ignorance. This was adaptation. The brutal kind that happens when the normal rules stop working and you either learn new ones or you die. And it wasn't just the Germans. Picture a forest in Belgium, December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge is grinding through its darkest days. Snow falls in thick curtains, muffling the world. A young American soldier, maybe 20 years old, crouches in a foxhole. He spent hours digging through frozen earth. His breath forms clouds that hang in the air before vanishing. He's learned something that contradicts everything he was taught in training. The heavy sleeping bag he was issued, the one that seemed like salvation back in the States, sits abandoned in a supply depot 15 miles behind the lines. He left it there deliberately, and because of that choice, he's still alive. The American forces in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 faced a similar reckoning. The U.S. Army had excellent sleeping bags, far better designed than the German ones. The M1942 mountain sleeping bag was a marvel of engineering for its time, with a water-resistant outer shell and down insulation that could keep a man warm even at 20 below zero. But there was a catch. The same catch there always is in war. You had to have it with you. And in the chaos of combat, when artillery is falling and you're moving from one foxhole to the next, when you're part of a desperate defense that might collapse at any moment, you don't carry your sleeping bag. You carry ammunition, you carry grenades, you carry the things that will keep you alive in the next hour, not the next night. So the sleeping bags stayed in the supply depots, or they got left behind in retreats, or they were assigned to rear echelon units who slept in heated tents and never really needed them. The infantry, the men actually holding the line in the frozen forests, made do with wool blankets and whatever shelter they could scrape together. And they discovered, just as the Germans had 3 years earlier, that sometimes less is more. That mobility and knowledge could trump equipment. That the soldiers who survived weren't necessarily the ones with the best gear, but the ones who understood their enemy. And in winter warfare, the enemy isn't just the soldiers on the other side of the line. It's the cold itself. It's the moisture in the air. It's the ground beneath you pulling heat from your body faster than a frozen wind ever could. It's your own sweat turning ice cold against your skin the moment you stop moving. The soldiers who figured this out, who learned to think of warmth as something you had to actively manage rather than passively receive from a sleeping bag, those were the ones who saw spring. There's a pattern that emerges when you read the after-action reports and the medical records from these campaigns. The units with the highest cold weather casualties weren't always the ones with the least equipment. Sometimes they were the units that had been issued proper winter gear but didn't know how to use it correctly. Or worse, trusted it too much, relied on it, believed that zipping themselves into a sleeping bag was enough to keep them alive. The veterans, the soldiers who'd been through multiple winters, they knew better. They'd learned that gear was a tool, not a guarantee, that your warmth was your responsibility, not your equipment's. And that survival in the cold required constant vigilance, constant small adjustments, constant awareness of where your heat was going and how to keep it from escaping. This wasn't something you could learn from a manual. It was something you figured out through experience, often bitter experience. And the lessons got passed along in whispers and warnings. Don't trust the bag if it's wet. Don't count on staying in one place long enough to use it. Don't let it become a crutch that keeps you from learning how to actually manage cold. I think about those abandoned sleeping bags sometimes, lying in the snow left behind by men who'd carried them for hundreds of miles. They weren't giving up. They were adapting, shedding what didn't work so they could carry what did, trading the promise of comfort for the possibility of survival. The gear you carry matters less than the knowledge you carry. This became almost a mantra among veterans. New replacements would arrive, their packs stuffed with everything the supply sergeant could issue, and the old-timers would shake their heads. "You'll learn," they'd say. "Give it a month. You'll learn what actually keeps you breathing." And in that choice and that willingness to abandon the conventional wisdom and figure out what actually worked, there's a lesson that goes far beyond winter camping or military history. It's about recognizing when the old answers stop working, when the equipment you've been told to trust becomes a liability, when survival depends not on having the right gear, but on understanding the real problem. For those soldiers, the real problem wasn't lack of equipment. It was lack of understanding. And once they grasped that, once they stopped thinking about sleeping bags and started thinking about heat management, everything changed. But understanding the problem is only the first step. You also have to know what you're fighting against. And that's where most people, even most soldiers, got it wrong. They thought the danger was the cold air, the wind, the falling snow. They thought if they could just block those things, they'd be warm. They were wrong. The real killers were far more subtle than that. And until you understood what they were, you couldn't hope to survive them. So let me tell you about the hidden enemies. The ones that took more lives than frostbite ever did. The ones that could kill you even on nights that didn't seem that cold, even when you were wrapped in layers, even when you thought you were safe. Let me tell you about the heat thieves. If you were to ask 100 people how the human body loses heat in cold weather, most of them would give you the same answer. The wind, the cold air, the snow. They'd talk about wind chill and temperature, and the obvious things, the things you can feel on your skin. And they'd be missing the point entirely. Because yes, those things matter, but they're not the real danger. The real danger is invisible. It's patient. It's the kind of enemy that kills you slowly, almost gently, while you're not paying attention. The soldiers of World War II learned about these enemies through a curriculum of frozen corpses and near-death experiences. They learned by watching men die on nights that didn't seem cold enough to kill, by seeing soldiers shivering themselves to exhaustion while wrapped in blankets, by waking up half-frozen after a night spent in what should have been adequate shelter. And slowly, through bitter trial and error, they figured out the truth. Your body is producing heat, constantly burning calories to keep your core temperature at 98.6 degrees. But that heat is escaping constantly too, leaking away through 4 distinct pathways, 4 routes of heat loss that work together to drain your warmth faster than you can replace it. The first thief is conduction. Direct contact, heat flowing from warm to cold through physical touch. And the greatest conductor of all, the one that killed more soldiers than enemy fire in some battles, was the ground itself. Picture this. It's January 1942. You're a Soviet infantryman defending Stalingrad. The temperature is 30 below zero. You've been fighting all day, and now as darkness falls, you need to rest. You find a spot against a ruined wall out of the wind. You wrap your greatcoat around yourself, pull your ushanka down over your ears, huddle into the smallest ball you can manage. And within an hour, you're colder than you were when you were moving. Because you made a fatal mistake. You lay down directly on the frozen ground. The earth in winter is an infinite heat sink. It's not just cold. It's a vast thermal mass that will absorb your body heat for as long as you're in contact with it. Your back, your legs, your hips, all the parts of you touching the ground are conducting heat into the frozen soil at a rate that's staggering. It doesn't matter how many layers you're wearing on top. The ground is pulling warmth out from underneath faster than your body can produce it. The German forces learned this lesson in the retreat from Moscow. There are medical reports from field hospitals describing soldiers brought in with hypothermia found barely conscious after a night spent sleeping on frozen ground. When the doctors examined them, they found that the soldiers' backs and buttocks were far colder than any other part of their bodies. Some had frostbite on their shoulder blades, damage to the muscle tissue from prolonged contact with cold earth, even though their chests and arms were relatively warm. One doctor wrote about it in his diary, trying to understand the mechanism. He calculated that the human body at rest produces about 100 watts of heat, about as much as a dim light bulb. But when you're lying on frozen ground, you can lose 200 watts or more through conduction alone. Your body can't keep up. The math doesn't work. You're burning more heat than you're making, and eventually, inevitably, your core temperature starts to drop. German soldiers on the Eastern Front called it der Bodentod, the ground death. Not a death that came quickly, dramatically, but a slow draining of life force through the night. You'd go to sleep merely exhausted and wake if you woke with a chill so deep in your core that no amount of movement could shake it. And here's the cruel part. You might not even notice it first, because the second thief, evaporation, has already been at work all day. Every breath you take releases moisture. Every drop of sweat your body produces requires energy to evaporate. And in the cold, that evaporation happens constantly, silently stealing heat away from you without you feeling it. Think about what happens when you march all day. Your body generates heat through movement. It sweats to regulate temperature. That sweat soaks into your underlayer, your shirt, your socks. And during the day while you're moving, you might not notice. You might even feel warm. But the moment you stop, the moment you settle in for the night, that moisture becomes a death sentence. Because evaporation is a cooling process. It's not just that the wet fabric feels cold. It's that the water in that fabric is actively pulling heat away from your body as it evaporates into the cold air. You're wrapped in a refrigerator of your own making, and you might not even realize it until you start shivering uncontrollably. The American forces in the Ardennes discovered this the hard way. The battle began in mid-December, and the early casualties from cold weren't from frostbite. They were from hypothermia, from soldiers who'd been sweating during the day's fighting, and then spent the night in damp uniforms, gradually losing body heat until their core temperature dropped below the point of no return. There's a medical report from a field hospital near Bastogne that describes treating hundreds of these cases. Young men physically fit who'd simply not understood the danger of moisture. They'd layer on extra socks thinking more was better, not realizing that more socks meant more sweat, meant more moisture trapped against their skin. By morning, some of them couldn't feel their feet. By afternoon, frostbite had set in. By evening, some were dead. The medic who wrote that report included a bitter observation. We teach them how to shoot. We teach them how to fight. But no one teaches them that the biggest danger isn't the Germans. It's their own sweat. A lieutenant from Wisconsin before the war, a high school teacher, wrote to his wife, "We sleep now like the hobos I used to see by the railroad tracks. Wrapped tight, everything tucked in, no loose ends for the wind to grab. It's not dignified. It's not comfortable. But we wake up, and that's more than I can say for the boys who tried to sleep proper." And then there's the third thief. Radiation. Not the atomic kind, but thermal radiation. Your body, like everything else, radiates heat as infrared energy. You can't see it or feel it directly, but it's happening constantly, especially from any exposed skin. Your face, your hands, your neck, all glowing in the infrared spectrum, bleeding warmth into the cold air. The Soviet soldiers understood this better than anyone. Their winter uniforms were designed with coverage in mind. High collars, long sleeves that extended over the hands, fur hats that could be pulled down to cover everything but the eyes. They'd seen what happened to soldiers who left even small patches of skin exposed. Frostbite, yes, but also something more insidious. A general cooling of the entire body, as if the exposed skin acted as a radiator pulling heat away from the core. There's a Soviet training manual from 1942, written after the first terrible winter of the war, that includes a calculation. A single hand exposed to winter air can radiate enough heat to cool your entire body by several degrees over the course of a night. Keep both hands uncovered, and you've effectively doubled your heat loss. Now add your face, and you're losing as much warmth through radiation as you are through all other routes combined. The solution was simple in theory, but required a kind of discipline that doesn't come naturally. You had to cover everything. And I mean everything. Wrap scarves over your face until you were breathing through layers of wool. Tuck your hands inside your coat. Pull your collar up and your hat down until there was nothing exposed to the air. It was claustrophobic. It was uncomfortable. It felt like being buried alive sometimes, but it worked. The soldiers who did this, who forced themselves to stay covered no matter how much they wanted to expose their face to check the surroundings or just feel fresh air, those soldiers stayed warmer. Their bodies didn't have to work as hard to maintain core temperature. They could sleep longer, function better, survive easier. And finally, there's the fourth thief, the one that ties all the others together. Convection. The movement of air across your body, stripping away the thin layer of warm air that your skin produces, replacing it constantly with fresh cold air that has to be warmed all over again. Wind is the obvious culprit here. The Germans on the Eastern Front faced winds that screamed across the open steppe with nothing to stop them. The wind chill could make a night that was already 30 below feel like 50 below. But convection happens even without wind. It happens whenever there's air movement, even the gentle circulation that occurs naturally in any shelter. The British Army, with their long experience of winter, fighting from the First World War, understood this principle well. Their training emphasized the importance of sealing shelters, not just covering them. A tarp over a foxhole wasn't enough if cold air could still flow in and out. You had to create what they called a dead air space, a pocket of still air around your body that would be warmed by your body heat and then stay warm because it had nowhere to go. This meant thinking about every gap, every opening. The space where the tarp met the ground, the entrance to your foxhole or snow cave, even the opening of your coat. Each one was a pathway for cold air to flow in and warm air to flow out, a constant circulation that would leave you shivering no matter how many layers you wore. There's a British training film from 1944 meant to prepare troops for winter fighting in Europe. In it, a sergeant demonstrates the proper way to seal a foxhole for the night. He uses snow to plug the gaps. He overlaps tarp so there's no straight path for wind to enter. He shows how to arrange your body so that the opening of your coat faces away from any air movement, creating a pocket of still air inside your clothing. The narration is matter-of-fact, almost bored. The soldier who masters these small attentions will be warm. The soldier who does not will be cold. It sounds simple when said like that. Obvious even. But the film exists because soldiers were dying from not knowing these things. Young men from cities who'd never spent a night outdoors in their lives suddenly thrust into the coldest winter in decades with no understanding of how their bodies lost heat or how to stop it. So they died. Not in battle. Not from wounds or disease. They died in their sleep from enemies they never saw and didn't understand. The ground beneath them, the moisture in their clothes, the air moving across their skin, the heat radiating from their uncovered faces. 4 thieves working together, patient and thorough. And if you wanted to survive, you had to understand all 4. You had to think about heat as something precious, something to be guarded carefully, something that required constant vigilance to maintain. The soldiers who grasped this, who started thinking of their bodies as furnaces that needed fuel and insulation and careful management, they were the ones who made it through. They were the ones who woke up cold but alive, rather than not waking up at all. And they passed along what they learned, in whispers and warnings, in the accumulated wisdom of men who'd survived what others hadn't. They taught each other to prioritize insulation from the ground, to change into dry clothes before sleeping even if it meant being colder for a few minutes, to cover every inch of exposed skin, to seal their shelters against air movement. These weren't heroic acts. They weren't the kind of things that get written up in after-action reports or earn medals. They were small, careful, methodical practices. the unglamorous work of staying alive when the cold wants to kill you. But here's what strikes me looking back at these stories. The soldiers didn't just learn to avoid the heat thieves, they learned to work with them, to use them. Because once you understand how heat escapes, you can also understand how to trap it, how to create a microenvironment around your body where warmth accumulates instead of dissipating, where the physics work in your favor instead of against you. And that knowledge, that understanding of how to turn your body and your clothing and whatever materials you have at hand into a system for managing heat, that was the real survival skill. Not the gear, not the equipment, the knowledge. So let me tell you about the first tool in that system. The most important tool. The one that required nothing but what you were already wearing and a willingness to accept temporary discomfort for long-term survival. Let me tell you about the cocoon. There's a moment in the middle of a cold night when your body makes a decision. It's not a conscious decision. It's deeper than that, older. It's the part of your brain that doesn't care about dignity or comfort or anything except survival. When your core temperature starts to drop, when the heat you're losing exceeds the heat you're producing, your body begins what's called cold-induced vasoconstriction. Blood vessels in your extremities, your hands and feet and skin, they constrict. They squeeze down to almost nothing. Your body is abandoning the perimeter to save the center, sacrificing your limbs to keep your heart and lungs and brain alive. The soldiers felt this happening, felt their fingers going numb, their toes disappearing into a cold that stopped feeling like cold and started feeling like nothing at all. And they knew what it meant. It meant they were losing, that the cold was winning. That if they didn't change something soon, the numbness would spread inward until it reached something vital. This is where most people fail. They try to add more layers, more blankets, more insulation. They think if they can just pile enough on top, they'll eventually get warm. But remember the problem. Remember the four thieves: conduction from the ground, evaporation from moisture, radiation from exposed skin, convection from air movement. Adding more layers doesn't solve any of those problems if the layers aren't working together correctly. You can wear 10 coats and still freeze to death if cold air is circulating underneath them, if moisture is trapped against your skin, if you're lying on frozen ground with nothing between you and that infinite heat sink. The soldiers who survived didn't think about adding more layers. They thought about creating a sealed system, a cocoon where their body heat had nowhere to go except back into warming them. Let me walk you through how they did it. Let me show you the technique that saved thousands of lives and gets taught to this day in advanced military survival courses. Not because it's comfortable, it isn't, but because it works when nothing else will. It starts with layers, but specific layers used in a specific way. The layer closest to your skin has to be dry, not damp, not slightly moist, completely, absolutely dry. Because remember, evaporation, that second thief. If your base layer is wet from the day's sweat, it's going to pull heat away from you all night long. There's no way around this. The physics doesn't care how tired you are or how much you don't want to undress in the cold. So the first step, and this is where it required real discipline, was to strip off the damp underlayer. In the middle of a frozen forest, with the temperature below zero, to expose your skin to air that could freeze it in minutes. The German mountain troops, veterans of winter campaigns in Norway and Finland before being sent to Russia, they understood this better than most. There are accounts from their officers describing the insistence on this practice. Before settling in for the night, no matter how exhausted, no matter how cold, the men would strip off their undershirts and long underwear. They'd wring out as much moisture as they could. And then here's the crucial part: they'd put on dry clothes, if they had them, or they'd layer the damp clothes on the outside, where they'd freeze, but at least wouldn't be in direct contact with skin. One veteran interviewed decades later described the shock of it. You'd think taking your clothes off in that cold would be the stupidest thing you could do, and for the first 30 seconds you'd be right. You'd be shaking teeth, chattering, thinking you'd made a terrible mistake. But then you'd get the dry shirt on, and within minutes you'd realize you were warmer than you'd been in hours. Because that wet layer had been stealing your heat all evening so slowly you hadn't noticed. Getting rid of it was like stopping a leak in a boat. Suddenly, you could make progress. But dry clothes alone aren't enough. You still have to seal them. And this is where the technique gets interesting, where it becomes less about gear and more about understanding how heat moves through layered fabric. Your body is constantly producing warm air. Your skin heats the air directly touching it, and that warm air wants to rise, wants to escape up through your collar or out through the gaps in your clothing. And as it escapes, fresh cold air flows in from below to replace it. You end up with a constant circulation, a chimney effect, where your body is heating air that immediately gets replaced with cold air that has to be heated all over again. The soldiers learned to prevent this circulation by creating barriers. They'd take their outer layer, their coat or greatcoat, and pull it tight. Not just buttoned, but actively pulled closed and held closed. Some of them would tie string around their waists to cinch the coat. Others would tuck the hem into their belt. The goal was to trap the warm air their body was producing to prevent it from escaping upward. But it didn't stop there. The collar had to be sealed. Scarves wrapped around the neck pulled up over the mouth and nose. Not for the face warmth, though, that helped, but to plug that escape route, to force the warm air to stay inside the layers instead of flowing out into the night. The sleeves had to be managed too. Some soldiers would tuck their hands inside their coats, pulling the sleeves down over their fists. Others would use string or strips of cloth to tie the cuffs tight. Again, the principle was the same. No openings, no pathways for the warm air to escape or the cold air to enter. And at the bottom, the coat had to be long enough to tuck under you when you lay down, or it had to be pulled down over your legs and tucked into your boots if you were sitting. Every opening, every gap, every potential pathway for air circulation had to be identified and sealed. The result was a kind of personal shelter, a microclimate where the only air movement was your breathing, where the warm air your body produced stayed close to your skin instead of dissipating into the night. You were in effect turning your clothing into a sleeping bag. Not a comfortable sleeping bag, a tight, restrictive, almost suffocating sleeping bag, but one that worked. There's a technical term for what they were creating. It's called an insulated boundary layer. Duh. And the key insight is that insulation doesn't keep you warm by generating heat. It keeps you warm by trapping a layer of still air next to your body. Air is actually an excellent insulator, one of the best natural insulators that exists. But only if it's still, only if it's not circulating. When you wear loose-flowing clothes, the air inside them is constantly moving. Warm air rises and escapes. Cold air flows in from below. Your insulation is worthless because the air inside it isn't staying put. But when you compress your layers, when you pull everything tight and seal all the openings, you trap that air. It can't circulate. It warms up from your body heat and stays warm. And that warm, still air acts as a buffer between your body and the cold world outside. The Soviet Red Army issued instructions on this in their winter warfare, training manuals, documents that were captured and translated by the Germans and eventually by the Americans. The language is blunt, practical. The soldier will secure all openings in his winter uniform. The coat will be belted tightly. The collar will be raised and fastened. The sleeves will be secured at the wrist. This is not optional. This is survival procedure. But creating the cocoon was only half the battle. You also had to maintain it. And this is where discipline came, in the ability to resist the temptation to loosen things when they became uncomfortable. Because they would become uncomfortable. When you seal yourself in like this, when you trap all that warm, moist air close to your body, it feels stuffy. It feels restrictive. There's a natural urge to loosen the collar, to unbutton the top button, to let some air in. Just for a moment. Just to breathe easier. And that moment could kill you. Because once you break the seal, once you allow circulation to start again, all the warm air you've been accumulating escapes. And then you're back to where you started, with your body working to warm air that's just going to disappear, fighting a battle you can't win. The experienced soldiers knew this. They'd learned it through nights of suffering, through waking up shivering because they'd loosened something in their sleep or given in to that urge for fresh air. They taught the new soldiers to simply accept the discomfort. To understand that feeling too warm, feeling almost smothered, was actually a good sign. It meant the cocoon was working. It meant their body heat was staying where it needed to be. There's a passage in a letter home from an American soldier in the Ardennes that captures this perfectly. He writes, "I spent the whole night feeling like I couldn't breathe right, like my coat was too tight and my scarf was choking me. But I remembered what the sergeant said about keeping everything sealed. So I didn't loosen anything. And when morning came, I was the only guy in my foxhole who wasn't shaking. The others had loosened up during the night and they paid for it." This technique wasn't about comfort. It was about turning your body into a furnace and your clothes into the walls of that furnace, carefully designed to keep the heat inside where it could do some good. It was about understanding that your survival depended not on passive insulation, but on active heat management, on making conscious choices to trap warmth even when it felt counterintuitive. And here's what amazes me about it. This wasn't taught in any pre-war manual. It wasn't part of standard military training. It was something that got figured out in the field by soldiers who were cold and desperate and willing to experiment with anything that might work. And then it got passed along soldier to soldier, unit to unit, until it became part of the informal doctrine of winter warfare. By the end of World War II, both the Soviets and the Western Allies were teaching versions of this technique in their cold weather training courses. It became standard procedure for anyone operating in extreme conditions. And today, if you take a survival course from someone who actually knows what they're talking about, who survived real cold and not just weekend camping trips, they'll teach you the same thing. Seal yourself in. Trap the heat. Accept the discomfort because the alternative is hypothermia. But even the best cocoon will fail if you're lying on frozen ground. Even perfectly trapped body heat will leak away through conduction if there's nothing between you and that infinite cold beneath you. And that's the next piece of the puzzle, the next technique that separated survivors from casualties. So let me tell you about the ground problem, and about the ingenious, sometimes desperate ways that soldiers learned to solve it with whatever they had at hand. Now we come to the part that sounds insane. The part that if you read it in a manual without context, you'd assume was a typo or a cruel joke. The instruction that has killed people who tried to follow it without understanding the why behind it. Take off your wet clothes in the middle of a freezing night. Everything in your biology, every instinct your body has, screams against this idea. When you're cold, you want to add layers, not remove them. The thought of exposing your skin to air that could freeze it within minutes feels like suicide. And yet this is exactly what the soldiers who survived learned to do. Let me explain why. And let me start with a simple question. What happens when you sweat? Your body is a machine that runs hot. Even at rest, you're producing heat-burning calories to maintain a core temperature of 98.6 degrees. But when you exert yourself, when you march 20 miles with a full pack or dig a foxhole in frozen ground, your body produces far more heat than it needs. So it sweats, releases water through your skin, which evaporates and cools you down. This is fine during the day. This is good during the day. It keeps you from overheating, keeps you functional. But the moment you stop moving, the moment you settle in for the night, that sweat becomes a time bomb waiting to go off. Because water has an incredible capacity to absorb and hold heat. It's one of the defining properties of water, the reason it regulates Earth's climate, the reason coastal areas have milder temperatures than inland areas. Water heats up slowly and cools down, slowly absorbing or releasing vast amounts of thermal energy in the process. When your clothes are damp with sweat, they're full of water. And that water is in direct contact with your skin, able to pull heat directly from your body. As the water evaporates, as it slowly transitions from liquid to gas, it requires energy. That energy comes from heat. Your heat. The heat your body is desperately trying to conserve. The physics here are brutal. It takes about 580 calories of energy to evaporate a single gram of water. Not food calories, thermal calories, but the principle is the same. Every gram of sweat in your clothing is pulling heat away from you, and it doesn't stop until all the water has evaporated. In a warm environment, this happens quickly, and you barely notice. But in freezing temperatures, evaporation slows down dramatically. That damp layer can stay damp for hours all night long, constantly pulling heat away from you at a rate that your body simply cannot match. The German soldiers learned this during the first winter in Russia, the winter they weren't prepared for. There are medical records from field hospitals describing soldiers brought in with severe hypothermia despite wearing multiple layers of clothing. When the doctors examined them, when they actually touched the uniforms, they found them damp, not soaking wet, just damp. Damp enough to have been steadily stealing body heat for hours. One doctor, in a report that would later influence German cold weather training, wrote about the paradox. The soldier believes he is insulated. He has multiple layers. He has wrapped himself carefully, but the dampness in his base layer is conducting heat away faster than all his other layers combined can trap it. He is effectively sleeping next to an ice block, and that ice block is his own underwear. The solution was counterintuitive, painful. It required the kind of willpower that doesn't come naturally. You had to strip off the damp layer in the cold, when every instinct was screaming at you to stay covered. The American forces in the Ardennes were taught this the hard way. The Battle of the Bulge began in mid-December, and the weather was the coldest it had been in decades. The soldiers, many of them new to combat, had been fighting in the snow all day. They'd been sweating despite the cold, exerting themselves, moving constantly. And when night fell, when they finally had a chance to rest, they did what seemed natural. They found whatever shelter they could and tried to sleep in their clothes. By morning, the medics were overwhelmed, not with combat casualties, with cold casualties, young men who couldn't walk because their feet were too swollen with frostbite, soldiers shaking so violently they couldn't hold a rifle, a few who didn't wake up at all. One medic in a letter home that's now part of the Army Medical Museum archives wrote about the pattern. They all say the same thing. They were cold when they lay down, but they thought they'd warm up once they stopped moving. Instead, they got colder. By midnight, they were shaking. By dawn, they were in real trouble. And when we check their socks, their shirts, everything against their skin, it's damp. Not even that damp, but enough. The experienced soldiers, the ones who'd survived previous winters, they had a different routine. And watching them understanding what they were doing and why became an informal education for anyone who wanted to live through more than one winter campaign. Here's how it worked. Before settling in for the night, before even thinking about trying to sleep, you'd assess your clothing. Touch your undershirt, feel your socks, check the fabric closest to your skin. If it was damp, if it felt even slightly moist, you had a decision to make. You could leave it on, accept that you'd be cold all night, hope that your body heat would eventually dry it out. Some soldiers tried this. Most of them regretted it. Because your body heat doesn't dry damp clothes efficiently when you're at rest. You don't produce enough excess heat. Instead, the clothes just stay damp and you stay cold. Or you could take off the damp layer, hang it somewhere to dry, using what little body heat you could spare, and either put on dry clothes if you had them, or go without a base layer, entirely relying on your outer layers to provide insulation. The second option sounds worse. It sounds like you're removing the insulation closest to your skin, the layer that should be keeping you warmest. But remember what we learned about heat thieves. A damp layer isn't insulating you. It's refrigerating you. It's actively making you colder. The Soviet soldiers who'd been fighting winter wars long before the Germans arrived had this figured out. There are accounts from captured Red Army training manuals translated and studied by German intelligence that describe the procedure in detail. The soldier removes the wet underlayer. He wrings it out as much as possible to remove excess moisture. Then he tucks it inside his coat against the less damp outer layers where his body heat can gradually dry it overnight without the fabric being in direct contact with his skin. Meanwhile, he puts on a dry layer if available, or simply relies on his outer coat and the sealed cocoon technique we discussed earlier. The instructions are specific about one thing. Do not, under any circumstances, put the damp clothes back on in the morning before they're fully dry. The shock of cold, wet fabric against your skin in the morning when your body's defenses are lowest can trigger rapid hypothermia. There's a kind of elegant problem-solving in this approach. Your body is a heater. Your clothes are the medium. By positioning the damp clothes where they're close enough to receive body heat, but not so close that they're pulling heat directly from your skin, you're using your own warmth as a drying machine. It's not fast. It might take all night. But it's energy efficient in a way that matters when calories are precious and every bit of heat counts. The German mountain troops, those who survived their first winter in Russia, adopted a variation of this technique. They'd remove their damp socks and underwear and tuck them inside their shirts against their abdomen or chest, where core body heat was highest. Then, they'd put on whatever dry layers they had, even if it meant going without an inner layer on their legs or feet. One veteran interviewed years later described how strange it felt. You'd take off your socks, and your feet would be so cold instantly that you'd think you'd made a horrible mistake. But you'd wrap your feet in spare fabric or tuck them inside your coat or use straw or pine boughs as insulation. And within half an hour, your feet would actually feel warmer than they had when the damp socks were on, because those socks had been stealing heat the whole time. But here's where it gets tricky, where soldiers had to develop judgment and experience, because not all dampness is equal. If your clothes are soaked, if they're wet enough to drip, you're in immediate danger. That much moisture can kill you quickly through evaporative cooling. You have to remove those clothes immediately, even if it means being briefly exposed to the cold. But if they're just slightly damp, if they're at that borderline where you're not sure if it's sweat or condensation or just humidity from your breath, then you have to make a calculation. How cold is it? How much energy do you have? What's your shelter situation? Can you afford to strip down and redress? Or would that expose you to more danger than leaving the clothes on? The experienced soldiers developed a kind of tactile literacy. They could feel the difference between clothes that were damp enough to be dangerous and clothes that would probably dry out overnight. They learned that wool, unlike cotton, could retain some insulating properties even when damp. That certain synthetics rare in World War II, but starting to appear, would wick moisture away from the skin rather than holding it. And they taught these distinctions to the newcomers, not through formal instruction, but through survival. Feel that that's too wet. You sleep in that you're going to be in trouble by midnight. Or, that's not so bad. If you can seal up tight, trap your body heat, it'll probably dry out enough. There's a mathematical elegance to this that I find striking. Your body at rest produces about 100 watts of heat. If your clothes are damp enough to be evaporating water, they can pull away 150 watts or more. You're operating at a deficit. The cold is winning. But if you remove that damp layer, if you eliminate that heat sink, suddenly you're in surplus. Your 100 watts is enough. You can maintain your temperature. You can survive the night. The soldiers didn't think about it in terms of watts and thermal dynamics. They thought about it in terms of what worked and what didn't. But they were conducting experiments in survival science every night, testing hypotheses with their own bodies, learning through immediate visceral feedback what the physics textbooks could have told them but didn't. There's a particular story that illustrates this principle beautifully. It comes from the Ardennes, from an American squad pinned down in the forest during the worst of the German counteroffensive. They'd been fighting all day, moving constantly, and when night fell, they were soaked with sweat, despite the freezing temperatures. The squad leader, a veteran of the Italian campaign where he'd learned about cold weather the previous winter, made a decision. He ordered his men to strip off their wet underlayers before trying to sleep. Some of them refused. They thought he was crazy. They argued that taking off clothes in that cold would kill them faster than keeping them on. He didn't argue back. He just said, "Do what you want, but I'm telling you that wetness will kill you before the cold does." He and 3 others who trusted him stripped down, wrung out their clothes, tucked them inside their coats to dry, and sealed themselves into their outer layers using the techniques we've discussed. The rest of the squad, 5 men, kept their damp clothes on and tried to sleep. By morning, the difference was stark. The 4 who'd changed were cold but functional, stiff, uncomfortable, but able to move and think clearly. The 5 who hadn't changed were in serious trouble. 2 couldn't walk without help. 1 was shaking so badly he had to be evacuated. All of them were showing signs of hypothermia. The squad leader didn't say, "I told you so." He just helped get the casualties to the rear and made sure everyone understood for the next night. And word spread. Across the division through informal channels, the lesson propagated. Strip off the wet layer. Yes, it's miserable. Yes, it feels wrong. But it works. A sergeant from Texas, his letters preserved in military archives, described the process. You got to get mean with yourself, strip down even when it makes you want to cry from the cold. Your body's lying to you, telling you to stay wrapped up, but wet wrapped is a death sentence. Better 5 minutes of shaking than sleeping forever. There's a story, perhaps apocryphal, but widely shared among veterans, of a German soldier found frozen to death in his sleeping bag, the bag itself, in perfect condition, rated for exactly the temperatures he faced. Investigation showed his underlayers were soaked with sweat from the previous day's march. He'd climbed into his bag without changing, seeking warmth and rest. The moisture had turned his expensive, well-made sleeping bag into a refrigeration unit, and he'd died, wrapped in what should have protected him. This technique, this willingness to temporarily expose yourself to cold in order to eliminate a worse source of heat loss, it appears again and again in survival accounts. It's not unique to World War II. Arctic explorers do it. Mountain climbers do it. Anyone who's survived serious cold has learned some version of this lesson, but it requires a specific kind of courage. Not the flashy kind, not the kind that wins medals. The quiet kind. The kind that lets you do something that feels terribly wrong because you understand the physics, because you trust the knowledge that's been passed down from those who learned it the hard way. And it requires something else too. It requires that you have somewhere to put yourself once the wet clothes are off. Some way to insulate your body from the ground that's waiting to steal your heat through conduction. Some way to get off that infinite heat sink and create a barrier between yourself and the frozen earth. So let me tell you about the ground problem. About the simple, ingenious solutions that soldiers developed using whatever materials they could scavenge. About how a helmet or a backpack or a pile of pine branches could mean the difference between life and death. I want you to imagine something. Imagine a block of ice, a big one the size of a bed. Now, imagine lying down on it wearing only a thin sheet. How long do you think you could stay there before you'd have to get up? Before the cold seeping into your back became unbearable. 5 minutes. 10. Now, imagine that instead of ice, it's frozen ground. Earth that's been cold for weeks, cold all the way down past where frost can reach cold in its bones. And imagine that you're lying on it not for 5 minutes, but for 6 hours. A whole night. Trying to sleep while that massive heat sink beneath you pulls warmth from your body at a rate that would shock you if you could measure it. This is what the soldiers faced. This was the problem that killed men who'd done everything else right, who'd sealed their clothing, who'd changed into dry layers, who'd found shelter from the wind. They'd understood the first 3 heat thieves: evaporation, radiation, convection. But they'd forgotten about the 4th and most deadly: conduction. The earth itself, patient and massive and absolutely unforgiving. There are medical reports from the Eastern Front, from German field hospitals, that describe a peculiar pattern of injury. Soldiers brought in with frostbite damage not to their extremities, which you'd expect, but to their backs, their buttocks, their shoulders, the parts of them that had been in contact with the ground all night. The tissue damage was sometimes worse than what you'd see from direct exposure to extreme cold, because it wasn't just cold, it was heat extraction on a massive scale. The ground was sucking warmth out of them faster than their bodies could produce it, and the contact area was so large, the thermal mass of the earth so vast, that their bodies never had a chance to warm it up. One German doctor wrote about examining a soldier who'd been found unconscious after a night spent sleeping directly on frozen ground. The man's back was so cold that the doctor could feel it through his gloves. The muscle tissue was stiff, almost rigid. When they tried to warm him, which in itself was dangerous, if done too quickly, the man screamed. The damage to his tissues was profound enough that he never fully recovered. But here's what's important. This soldier had been wearing a heavy greatcoat. He'd had blankets. He'd had the kind of equipment that in theory should have kept him alive. What he didn't have was anything between him and the ground. He'd thought the thickness of his coat would be enough. It wasn't. Not even close. The physics here are elegant and brutal. The ground frozen solid is an infinite heat sink. You could pump heat into it forever and never warm it up. Every molecule of warmth that transfers from your body into the earth simply diffuses away, spreading out into that vast cold mass, disappearing like a drop of hot water in an ocean. and the rate of transfer is staggering. Conduction. Direct contact heat transfer is far more efficient than convection or radiation. When your body touches cold ground, the heat flows out of you at a rate that can be 5 to 10 times faster than heat loss to cold air. The soldiers learned this the hard way, but once they learned it, they adapted. And their solutions were ingenious in their simplicity. Because you don't need sophisticated insulation to break the conduction pathway. You just need air, dead airspace. A gap between your body and the ground that prevents direct contact. The German soldiers started with the most obvious material at hand, their helmets. The steel Stahlhelm that had become a symbol of the Wehrmacht. When you're lying down trying to sleep, your helmet becomes useless on your head. But placed under your back, it creates a raised platform. A small one, yes, but enough to lift your spine and part of your back off the ground. Enough to create an air gap that, combined with the fabric of your coat, provides meaningful insulation. One veteran described it as revelation. I'd been cold every night, shivering myself awake. I couldn't understand why nothing helped. Then, an older soldier showed me. Put the helmet under your lower back, he said, just there where your kidneys are. I thought it would be uncomfortable. It was, but within an hour I realized I was warmer than I'd been in weeks. Because of that one spot, that connection between my back and the frozen ground, it had been draining heat from my core all along. Break that connection and everything changed. But a helmet only covers so much. The soldiers needed more. They scavenged. They improvised. They used their backpacks, their rucksacks, laying them flat under their torsos. They used spare clothes, anything they weren't wearing rolled up and positioned under their sleeping bodies. They used branches. Pine boughs were particularly valued because they were flexible enough to conform to body shape while still maintaining airspace underneath. Helmets. The steel pots that protected heads from shrapnel found new purpose as insulation platforms. Turned upside down, they created air pockets. Soldiers would place them under their hips, their shoulders, any pressure point where body met ground. The metal conducted cold, yes, but the air gap beneath the helmet's dome was worth it. Backpacks emptied of their contents became mattresses of a sort. Not soft, not comfortable, but crucially lifting torso and hips away from direct contact with frozen earth. The canvas and leather and whatever was packed inside created layers. And layers meant trapped air, and trapped air meant insulation. In forests where pine and spruce grew, soldiers cut boughs and wove them into rough mats. The technique was ancient, probably older than recorded history. Stack enough pine branches and you create a springy bed that compresses under your weight, but never fully flattens, maintaining those precious air pockets. The resin in the needles resisted moisture too, staying relatively dry even in damp conditions. The Soviet soldiers, many of whom came from rural backgrounds, already understood this principle from civilian life. There are accounts from captured training manuals that describe the bed of branches. The soldier would gather pine or fir branches and layer them, creating a platform 6 to 8 inches thick. Then, he'd sleep on top of this platform with his coat wrapped around him. The instructions specify that the branches should be layered with the springy ends pointing up, creating thousands of tiny air pockets between the layers. This wasn't just padding, it was engineering. Each air pocket was an insulating cell, and together they formed a barrier that dramatically reduced heat loss to the ground. There's a calculation in one of these manuals written by someone who clearly understood the physics. A man sleeping directly on frozen ground can lose up to 200 watts of heat through conduction. That's twice what his body produces at rest. He's in a losing battle from the start. But place even a modest insulating layer between him and the ground, even just 4 inches of pine branches, and you can reduce that loss by 75% or more. Suddenly he's losing 50 watts through the ground instead of 200. His body can compensate. He can maintain his core temperature. He can survive the night. The British Army, drawing on experience from World War I, where trench warfare had taught brutal lessons about ground cold, issued specific instructions about bedding. The shelter half, that versatile piece of canvas that could be combined with another soldier's to make a tent, was also intended as ground insulation. The manual specified that the shelter half should be folded in quarters and placed under the soldier's body, creating multiple layers of canvas with air trapped between them. One British veteran interviewed decades later remembered this instruction saving his life during the Italian campaign. It was a clear night in the Apennines, cold but not impossibly so. I found a spot that seemed sheltered, thought I'd be all right. Then I remembered the manual. Fold your shelter half and sleep on it. It seemed like such a small thing, but I woke up the next morning while lads around me didn't. The ground had taken them, not the cold air, the ground. But let's be specific about technique here because the details matter. It's not enough to just throw something on the ground and lie on it. You have to think about coverage and compression. Coverage first. The insulation needs to cover your entire torso from your shoulders to your hips. This is where your major organs are, where your body will defend its core temperature most desperately. If you have limited material, if you can only insulate part of your body, this is the part to prioritize. Your legs can get cold. Your arms can get cold. You'll be uncomfortable, but you'll live. But if your core temperature drops, if the cold reaches your heart and lungs and liver, your body starts shutting down in ways you can't recover from. Then there's compression. This is the tricky part. If you use soft material foam or clothes or even pine branches, your body weight will compress it. The air pockets get squashed, the insulation value drops. What started as 4 inches of material might compress down to 2 inches under your weight, having its effectiveness. The experienced soldiers learned to account for this. They'd gather more material than seemed necessary, building a thicker platform to compensate for compression. Or they'd use firmer materials that wouldn't compress as much. Thick branches, multiple layers of equipment, anything that could maintain structure under their weight. And they learned about problem areas. The small of your back where your spine curves tends to press down harder than your shoulders or hips. This creates a pressure point where compression is worse, where insulation fails first. Some soldiers would specifically place extra padding there, a folded jacket, a concentration of pine boughs, whatever it took to maintain that crucial air gap at the point where heat loss was fastest. There's an American Army training bulletin from late 1944 issued after the Ardennes casualties that includes a photograph. It shows a soldier preparing a sleeping position correctly. He's gathered pine branches and arranged them in a thick mat. He's folded his shelter half in quarters and placed it on top of the branches. He's positioned his backpack as a pillow, which also serves to lift his head and neck off the ground. The caption reads, "Proper field procedure for winter bivouac. Note insulation from ground exceeds 3 inches after compression." 3 inches. That was the number they'd arrived at through experiment and bitter experience. 3 inches of insulating material accounting for compression was enough to keep a man alive through a winter night. Less than that, and you were gambling. More was better, but not always practical given the materials available and the time you had. And time was always a factor. In combat conditions, you might only have minutes to prepare your sleeping position before exhaustion overwhelmed you. The soldiers developed quick methods: kick aside snow to expose pine needles or leaves underneath, pile them quickly, throw your shelter half on top, lie down before you lose the will to move. It wasn't comfortable. Pine boughs are not a mattress. Branches dig into your back. Frozen ground is hard even with insulation on top of it, but comfort wasn't the goal. Survival was. And the soldiers who accepted this, who understood that a night of discomfort was better than a morning of not waking up, those soldiers lived to see spring. There's something almost medieval about these techniques. Something that connects these 20th century soldiers to every human who's ever had to sleep in the cold without modern equipment. The principle of staying off the ground, of creating space between yourself and the earth, it's ancient. It predates recorded history. But understanding why it works, understanding the physics of conduction and insulation, that's modern. And that understanding allowed the soldiers to optimize their techniques in ways that their ancestors couldn't. They knew that air was the key, that the material didn't matter as much as the air trapped within it. That compression was the enemy. That coverage needed to prioritize the core. This knowledge, passed from veteran to recruit, from the experienced to the untested, saved thousands of lives. It turned soldiers who would have been casualties into soldiers who could function the next day. who could fight or march or simply survive long enough to be pulled out of the line. And here's what strikes me about all of this. These men were doing advanced thermodynamics without knowing the terminology. They were conducting experiments in heat transfer, using their own bodies as the test subjects. They were figuring out principles that engineers would later codify in textbooks about insulation and survival. But they weren't thinking about it that way. They were just trying not to die, trying to make it through one more night. Using whatever they had at hand, whatever materials the landscape provided, whatever gear they could spare from its primary purpose. A helmet becomes a platform. A backpack becomes insulation. A pile of branches becomes a bed. Not because these things were designed for that purpose, but because desperate men are ingenious, because survival sharpens the mind, because when the alternative is death, you figure things out. And what they figured out, what they learned and passed along it, wasn't about having the right equipment or the latest technology. It was about understanding the problem deeply enough that you could solve it with anything, with nothing, with just knowledge and whatever the world around you happened to provide. But even with perfect ground insulation, even with your body lifted off that deadly cold earth, you're still losing heat through radiation and convection. Your body is still producing warmth that's escaping into the night air. And there's only so much warmth one body can produce, unless of course you're not using just one body. Unless you understand that humans are social animals for a reason, that sometimes survival is a collaborative effort. So let me tell you about shared warmth, about the techniques that made some soldiers uncomfortable but kept entire squads alive, about the mathematics of cooperative physics and the psychology of survival. There's a shape that the human body wants to take when it's cold. You've done it yourself probably on winter mornings when you don't want to get out of bed. You curl inward, knees pulling up toward your chest, arms wrapped around your torso, head tucked down. The fetal position, though that term doesn't quite capture it, it's more primal than that. It's the shape of conservation. The soldiers discovered this instinctively, but they learned to refine it, to understand exactly why this position worked and how to optimize it for maximum heat retention. Let me walk you through the physics first, because once you understand what's happening, the technique makes perfect sense. Your body is constantly losing heat through radiation. Remember, you're a warm object in a cold environment, and like anything warm, you're radiating infrared energy into the space around you. The amount of energy you radiate depends directly on your surface area. More surface area means more heat loss. It's that simple. When you lie stretched out, when your body is fully extended, you're presenting maximum surface area to the cold air. Every inch of your skin is radiating heat. Your legs, your arms, your torso, all of it exposed to the night. You're losing heat as fast as your body can produce it, and in the cold, that's usually faster than you can afford. But when you curl up, when you pull everything in tight, you're reducing your surface area dramatically, maybe by 30% or more. And that means you're reducing your heat loss by the same amount. Suddenly, your body's heat production can keep up with your heat loss. The balance shifts in your favor. There's more to it, though. The position isn't just about reducing surface area, it's about protecting your core. Your body's vital organs, your heart and lungs and liver, they're all concentrated in your torso. This is where your body maintains the highest temperature, where it defends most desperately against cold. When your core temperature drops even by a few degrees, your body's ability to function starts degrading rapidly. In the extended position, your torso is exposed. Cold air circulates around it. Ground cold conducts into it if your insulation isn't perfect. But in the curled position, your knees and arms form a protective shell around your core. They act as an outer layer of insulation, a buffer zone. The cold has to get through your limbs before it can reach your vital organs, and your limbs can take more cold. They can survive temperatures that would be fatal to your core. Your body knows this. When you start getting seriously cold, your body automatically restricts blood flow to your extremities to preserve core temperature. You're sacrificing your fingers and toes to save your heart and brain. It's a brutal calculation, but it's the calculation that keeps you alive. The curled position works with this strategy rather than against it. You're using your extremities as they're designed to be used in cold environments as shields for the vital center. The German soldiers on the Eastern Front learned to sleep curled tight. There are accounts from survivors describing the position in detail. Knees pulled up until your thighs are pressed against your abdomen, arms crossed over your chest hands, tucked into your armpits where your body produces significant heat. Head bowed forward, chin tucked down to protect your neck and throat. The whole body compressed into the smallest possible ball. One veteran described it as trying to become a turtle. You pull everything in. You make yourself as small as possible. It's uncomfortable. Your hip hurts from the pressure. Your knees ache. But you're warmer, noticeably, measurably warmer, and in that cold warmth was everything. But there's an art to doing this right. Because if you just curl up randomly, you'll create problems. Pressure points where your bones press into the ground despite your insulation. Circulation restrictions that make your limbs go numb. Positions that you can't maintain for a full night because they're too painful or unstable. The experienced soldiers developed a specific technique. Let me describe it step by step the way it would have been taught in a whispered lesson in a frozen foxhole. First, you position yourself on your side. Not your back, not your stomach, but your side. This is important because it minimizes the surface area touching the ground while still being stable enough to maintain throughout the night. Then you curl. Your bottom knee bends pulled up toward your chest, but not so far that it creates uncomfortable pressure on your hip. Your top knee bends even more, tucking up and in. The two knees should be close together, not splayed apart, because the gap between them would allow cold air to reach your core. Your arms come next. The bottom arm, the one you're lying on, can be bent and tucked under your head as a pillow. Or it can extend forward slightly, taking some of the pressure off your shoulder. The top arm crosses over your torso. Your hand can tuck into your armpit, or it can grip your upper arm, or it can simply rest against your chest. The goal is to seal the front of your torso to eliminate any gap where cold air could reach your stomach and chest. Finally, your head. You bow it forward, bringing your chin down toward your chest. This protects your neck, an area where major blood vessels run close to the skin and can lose heat rapidly. If you have a scarf or hood, you pull it up and around, creating a protected pocket for your face. German mountain troops trained for winter warfare before the war even started learned specific sleeping postures. The alpine curl, they called it, a position refined through generations of high-altitude climbing. On your side, knees drawn sharply up, one arm beneath your head, the other wrapped around your knees, pulling them tighter. Your back curved, creating a protected hollow for your chest and abdomen. The entire position should feel compact, sealed, like you're trying to fit into an invisible box that's just slightly too small for you. There should be tension in your muscles, a constant pull inward. This isn't comfortable. But comfort isn't available. You're choosing between mild discomfort and life-threatening cold. The Soviet Army in their winter warfare manual includes a diagram of this position. A simple line drawing of a soldier curled on his side with annotations pointing to key elements. Knees together, arms crossed, head tucked. The text is matter of fact. This position will be maintained throughout the night. Discipline in maintaining position is essential for survival. And discipline was required because the temptation to stretch out to change position was constant. Your hip would start aching from the pressure. Your top leg would cramp from being bent so long. Your shoulder would hurt from being compressed under your weight. And you'd want to roll onto your back, extend your legs just for a moment, just to relieve the discomfort. But the veterans knew. They'd learned through cold nights and colder mornings. The moment you stretched out, you felt the cold rush in, like opening a door to winter. Within minutes, you'd be shivering, all the warmth you'd accumulated in your protected curl dissipating into the night. So you held the position. You endured the ache. You focused on the relative warmth of your core, the knowledge that you were doing what you could to survive. And eventually, if you were lucky, exhaustion would overwhelm discomfort and you'd sleep. There's a beautiful piece of adaptation in all this. The curled position isn't just about physics and heat retention, it's also psychological. When you curl up, when you pull yourself into that tight ball, you're creating a sense of security that's almost instinctive. It's the position humans take when they're afraid, when they're seeking comfort, when they're trying to protect themselves from the world. In the frozen darkness of a winter battlefield, with the sounds of distant artillery and the knowledge that you might not survive until morning, that psychological comfort mattered. The position itself became a kind of ritual, a way of telling yourself that you were doing everything possible, that you were taking control of what you could control. One American soldier, writing home from the Ardennes, described it in almost poetic terms. "We sleep curled up like children, like babies in the womb. It's strange to feel so vulnerable and so protected at the same time. The cold is all around us, but in our little curls, we're holding on to warmth, holding on to life." But let's talk about the morning, because that's where the curled position exacted its price. After 6 or 8 hours in that compressed posture, your body would be stiff. Your muscles would have tightened in their bent positions. Your joints would ache from the constant pressure. Getting up required care. If you tried to stand too quickly, to extend too fast, you'd cramp. Your legs might not support you. You'd stumble, and in combat conditions, that stumbling could be fatal. The veterans developed a wake-up routine. You'd start moving small parts first. Wiggle your toes inside your boots, flex your fingers, roll your shoulders slightly, gradually increasing the movement, warming the muscles, getting blood flowing again. Only then would you unbend your knees, extend your legs, sit up. It took time, precious minutes when you might need to be ready to fight or move. But it was necessary. Your body needed to transition back to functionality, and rushing that transition just led to injury. There are medical reports from the Eastern Front describing soldiers who'd injured themselves in exactly this way. Torn muscles from extending too quickly after a night curled in the cold, pulled tendons, compressed nerves that took hours to recover function. These weren't combat injuries, but they were casualties nonetheless. Men removed from action because they'd tried to move too fast after a night spent in survival mode. And yet, despite the discomfort and the risks, the curled position worked. It kept men alive who would have died stretched out. It gave them a fighting chance in temperatures that should have killed them. The data, such as it exists from wartime medical records, supports this. Units that adopted the curled sleeping position showed lower rates of hypoth. Now we come to something that's both tactical and deeply human: the practice of sleeping in groups, sharing warmth, turning a collection of individuals into a collective survival unit. It's counterintuitive in some ways. Military training emphasizes self-reliance. You're taught to be responsible for yourself, to not be a burden. But winter survival sometimes requires you to abandon that individualism and trust others with your life in a very literal sense. 2 men sleeping back-to-back generate a combined heat output of about 200 watts. But their combined surface area when they're pressed together is less than if they were sleeping separately. The contact area between them, their backs touching, is no longer losing heat to the air. It's a shared warm zone. Both men benefit. 3 men can do even better. 4 is optimal for heat sharing in a small space. More than that, and you start having diminishing returns because you can't all maintain contact, and the logistics of coordinating that many people in a tight space become problematic. American soldiers at Bastogne during the siege figured this out. They were surrounded, cut off from supply, and the temperatures were well below freezing. At night, in their foxholes and makeshift shelters, they'd sleep in pairs or trios, not just for warmth, though that was the practical reason, but for morale, for the psychological comfort of not facing the night alone. There's a powerful account from a medic with the 101st Airborne. He wrote, "We'd pair up at night. Different partners sometimes, whoever you ended up near. You'd lie down back to back, or if it was really cold, we'd spoon. Yeah, spoon. Like lovers. And nobody said a word about it because we all understood that this wasn't about anything except not dying. You'd feel the other guy's warmth against your back, feel his breathing, know you weren't alone. And in the morning, you'd separate and get back to being soldiers. But at night, we were just mammals trying to survive winter." The physical benefit is measurable. Studies done later in the Cold War era on soldiers training in Arctic conditions showed that paired sleeping reduced individual heat loss by 30–40% compared to sleeping alone. That's enormous. That's the difference between maintaining core temperature and sliding into hypothermia. But the technique requires trust. You're depending on your partner to stay put, to not roll away in the night, to maintain contact. And you're in a vulnerable position, asleep or trying to be in a combat zone. If you're attacked, you have to disentangle before you can respond. It's a calculated risk. The British forces, drawing on experience from earlier conflicts and from Arctic training, actually formalized this in some of their field manuals. They called it tactical grouping for thermal efficiency. Very British phrasing. But the content was straightforward when operating in extreme cold without adequate shelter sleep. In groups of 2 to 4, maximizing body contact, rotating positions periodically so that the outer positions which lose more heat are shared equally. The rotation is important. If you're in a group of 3 lying in a row, the person in the middle is warmest. They have body heat on both sides. The people on the ends have one cold side exposed to the air. If you kept the same positions all night, the end people would suffer more. So you rotate. Every hour or two you shift. Middle person moves to an end person moves to middle. It's fair, and fairness matters for morale, for trust. Soviet soldiers did this too, especially in the terrible winter of 1941-1942, when many units lacked adequate clothing and shelter. They'd dig a long trench barely deep enough to get below ground level and sleep in it like sardines. 5, 6, 7 men in a row. They'd cover themselves with whatever they had: coats, blankets, shelter halves, and share the covering as well as body heat. One account from a Red Army infantryman described this. We called it the sleeping snake. A line of men curled together. The man at the head of the snake and the man at the tail suffered most. We'd rotate through the night. Everyone took a turn at the end. It was miserable. You're pressed against other men, can't move, can't get comfortable. But you're alive. Alone, you'd freeze. Together, you survive. That's socialism. He meant it as a dark joke, but there's truth in it. Collective action in the face of indifferent nature is more effective than individual effort. There's also a psychological dimension to shared sleeping that can't be dismissed. Winter darkness, especially in northern latitudes where nights are long, is oppressive. It weighs on you. Men would develop depression, anxiety, a sense of cosmic insignificance when facing the vast cold alone. But sleeping in contact with others, hearing their breathing, feeling their presence, that fight off the isolation. It reminded you that you were human, that you were part of a group, that you mattered to someone, even if only as a source of warmth. Stories emerged from the bulge of men who'd been separated from their units, wandering alone in the forest, who simply gave up when night came. They'd sit down against a tree, pull their coat around themselves, and wait for the end. Not because they were physically unable to survive the night. Some of them were found later with adequate clothing, with food in their packs. They gave up mentally. The loneliness, the isolation broke them before the cold did. But men in groups, even small groups, even groups of strangers thrown together by the chaos of battle, they kept fighting, kept trying, because they had witnesses, because they couldn't let the others down. Because humans are social animals, and we're stronger together, even if that strength is just the 30% reduction in heat loss from sleeping back to back. There's a technique that was used by German mountain troops that's worth mentioning. When they had a shelter half or tent between them, they'd sleep in a radial pattern, head to the center, feet to the outside. This created a central warm zone where all their heads, the highest heat loss areas of the body, were close together. They'd breathe into that central space, warming it. And they could talk quietly if needed, coordinate without shouting. It was efficient, and efficiency meant survival. American paratroopers adopted a similar method. After a drop, when they were scattered and regrouping, small groups would shelter together. They'd share their shelter halves, buttoning them together to make a larger cover. Then they'd huddle under it. The shared covering was more effective than individual covers because it enclosed a single air volume, a single warm zone, instead of multiple smaller zones. And there was an unspoken rule: you didn't abandon your sleeping partners. If you woke up and needed to move to relieve yourself, to check on something, you did it carefully. You didn't just get up and leave them exposed to the cold. You'd wake the person next to you, let them know, maybe shuffle positions, so the gap you left was minimized. It was courtesy, it was respect, it was survival protocol. When dawn came, when the group separated and returned to individual identities, there was often a moment of acknowledgement, a nod, a brief word. Made it. Yeah, nothing more needed to be said. You'd survived another night, together. And if the war continued, you might not sleep next to the same person the following night. Or you might. Didn't matter. The bond was temporary but real, forged in shared vulnerability. This is one of the aspects of war that's hard to explain to people who haven't been through it. The intimacy that develops not from friendship or even from liking someone, but from shared survival. You'd trust a man with your life, not because you knew him well, but because you'd spent the night pressed against his back, breathing the same cold air, making it to morning as a unit. That creates a connection that's deeper than casual friendship. It's primal. And when the war ended, when the survivors went home, this was one of the hardest things to leave behind. Not the camaraderie of shared jokes or shared experiences, but the knowledge that your survival was directly tied to another person's warmth, that you weren't alone against the universe. That sounds dramatic. But winter in a war is dramatic. It's life and death played out in slow motion every night, and the men who survived it together carried that knowledge forever. The German soldiers called this practice Kameradenwärme, comrade warmth, not just a technique, but a philosophy. You didn't survive winter alone. You survived as a pair, as a group, as a collective organism, fighting cold together. There's a beautiful description from a chaplain serving with the 99th Infantry Division. He wrote about finding a group of soldiers sleeping in the snow arranged in a tight circle, and thinking at first he'd found casualties. But then he saw the slow rhythm of breathing, the shared exhalations creating a small cloud of mist in the center of their circle. He wrote, "They looked like petals of a flower drawn together by the cold, creating warmth from their collective being." It was the most hopeful thing I'd seen in this war. Let's talk about a piece of equipment that doesn't sound impressive, but turned out to be one of the most crucial items a soldier carried: the shelter half. That simple rectangle of canvas that weighed almost nothing and could save your life in a dozen different ways. The U.S. Army shelter half was about 5 feet by 7 feet. Canvas. Later in the war, some were made from a cotton nylon blend. It had buttons along 2 edges and grommets at the corners. The idea was that 2 soldiers would button their halves together to make a pup tent, a minimal shelter, but better than nothing. Except in the chaos of combat, you weren't always with your tent partner. Units got separated, men got reassigned, and you'd find yourself with a half tent that couldn't be a tent. But you'd quickly realize it could be something else, something more versatile. German soldiers had something similar, the Zeltbahn. It was actually more sophisticated in some ways, triangular. Could be buttoned to other Zeltbahns to make various configurations, a tent, a lean-to, a larger communal shelter. It could also be worn as a rain poncho. The Germans understood multifunctionality, but whether we're talking about the American shelter half or the German Zeltbahn, the principle was the same. A piece of windproof, reasonably waterproof fabric that could adapt to different survival needs. In winter conditions, that adaptability was life-saving, because the shelter half could be a ground pad, folded to insulate from the frozen earth, a windbreak, strung up to block the prevailing wind, a blanket, wrapped around you for an extra layer, a vapor barrier. The canvas was tight woven enough that it blocked wind, but breathed enough to let moisture escape. Let's focus on that last point, the vapor barrier concept. This is more sophisticated than it sounds. When you're generating body heat inside layers of clothing or blankets, you're also generating moisture from your sweat and your breath. That moisture needs somewhere to go. If it can't escape, it condenses on the inside of your outer layer, making everything damp. We've already established that damp equals death in cold weather. But if your outer layer is completely air permeable, then you're losing all your warm air to convection. The cold wind blows right through, stealing your heat. Canvas particularly, the tight-woven canvas of military shelter halves, hits a middle ground. It blocks wind almost completely. Wind can't penetrate the weave, but moisture vapor can slowly migrate through. It's not perfect. You're still going to get some condensation. But it's better than the alternatives. German soldiers on the Eastern Front used their Zeltbahns wrapped around themselves like cloaks when they slept. The triangular shape when wrapped created a cone with the soldier inside. They'd button it closed, leaving just an opening for their face. The canvas shell blocked the wind completely. Inside, they'd have their wool clothing their body heat. The canvas didn't add much insulation by itself, but by stopping convective heat loss, it made their existing insulation far more effective. There's a field report from a Gebirgsjäger unit in the Caucasus winter, 1942-1943. The officer noted, "Without the Zeltbahn, survival in exposed positions would be impossible. The canvas shell allows the soldier to create a personal microclimate regardless of external wind conditions. Men learn to configure the Zeltbahn in various ways depending on the situation. Wrap tight for maximum warmth, loosely draped to allow movement, strung between two soldiers to create a shared shelter." The versatility is critical because winter conditions change rapidly and shelter must adapt. American soldiers discovered similar techniques with their shelter halves. One popular configuration in the Ardennes was the burrito wrap. B. You'd lay the shelter half on the ground, lie down on one edge, then roll yourself up in it. The canvas would wrap around you in a spiral. You'd end up encased in a windproof tube. It looked absurd, but it worked. The canvas held in your body heat. It blocked the wind. And if you'd positioned yourself on dry ground or on some other insulation, you'd significantly reduced both conductive and convective heat loss. You wouldn't be warm, but you could maintain a survivable temperature. There's a memoir from a lieutenant in the 106th Infantry Division. He described a night in mid-December 1944. "We were in a forest, no shelter, snow coming down. I showed the men the burrito wrap. Some of them laughed. 'Sir, we're going to look like idiots.' I said, 'Better to look like an idiot than die like one.' By 300 hours, every man was wrapped. No more laughing. Some of them were crying from cold and fear, but they were alive and functional. By dawn, we'd held the position and could still fight. That's what mattered." Another use for the shelter half that emerged through field innovation combined insulation and vapor barrier. You take your wool blanket and your shelter half. Put the blanket inside the shelter half, wrapping them together. The wool provided the insulation, the soft layer that trapped air. The canvas provided the wind block and kept the wool dry from external moisture. Together, they were more effective than either alone. This is a basic principle of modern outdoor gear design. The layering of different materials with different properties to achieve a system that's greater than the sum of its parts. But in World War II, this wasn't coming from designers. It was coming from cold soldiers trying not to die. Soviet soldiers didn't have individual shelter items like the shelter half or Zeltbahn in many units, especially early in the war, but they improvised with whatever they could scavenge. Captured German Zeltbahns were prized, pieces of tarpaulin, even sections of parachute silk from supply drops, anything that could block wind and shed water. There's an interesting account from a Soviet partisan group operating behind German lines in Belorussia in winter 1943. They had no standard issue gear. Everything was scrounged or improvised. One partisan described their sleeping arrangements. "We'd take whatever fabric we could find. German tent sections, pieces of old curtains from burned villages. We'd sew them together into large sheets. At night, the whole group, maybe 10 of us, would lie together under these sheets. The fabric would trap our combined body heat. On the coldest nights, we'd cover ourselves with snow on top of the fabric. The snow added insulation. As long as the inner layer stayed dry, we survived. It was primitive, but effective." That's an advanced technique using snow as insulation. It sounds counterintuitive, but dry, powdery snow is mostly air. It's actually a decent insulator. The problem is if it melts from your body heat, then you have water against you, and that's catastrophic. But if you have a vapor barrier between you and the snow, like a layer of canvas or rubber, then the snow layer can add insulation value without the danger of melting and soaking you. Inuit peoples have known this forever. Igloos work on this principle. Snow blocks stacked to make a dome. Inside, the body heat of the inhabitants warms the air, but the snow doesn't melt because the interior air temperature stabilizes just below freezing. The thick snow walls insulate against the much colder outside air. And a shelter that's 30 degrees Fahrenheit inside is positively tropical when it's minus 40 outside. Some soldiers, learning from local populations in northern Russia or from soldiers who'd trained in Arctic conditions, started building similar structures when they had the time and materials. Not proper igloos necessarily, but snow shelters. Snow trenches with roof blocks, anything to get below the wind and use the snow's insulation properties. The shelter half played a role here too. You could use it as a roof liner inside a snow shelter. The canvas would catch any drips or melt from the snow roof before they reached you. It would also reflect some of your radiant heat back down, making the shelter slightly more efficient. But most nights in combat, you didn't have time to build elaborate snow shelters. You had what you were carrying. And that often came down to your shelter half your blanket, maybe a coat, and your knowledge of how to use them. The soldiers who survived were the ones who understood that the shelter half wasn't just a tent component. It was a windbreak, a ground pad, a vapor barrier, a blanket, a signal panel, a stretcher, a water collector. It was whatever you needed it to be. Versatility is survival. By the end of the European War, experienced soldiers had developed almost instinctive knowledge of how to deploy their shelter half for maximum benefit. They didn't need to think about it. They'd find a position, assess the wind direction, the ground conditions, the available time, and they'd configure their shelter accordingly. Folded as a pad, wrapped as a cloak, strung as a windbreak, whatever the situation demanded. And that versatility, that ability to adapt a simple tool to complex changing conditions, that's a deeper lesson. It's not about having the perfect gear. It's about understanding the principles, understanding what you're fighting against: wind-ground conduction, moisture, radiative loss, and then using whatever you have to fight back. The shelter half wasn't high-tech. It wasn't fancy. It was just canvas. But in the hands of a soldier who understood survival, it was enough. And enough is all you need when the alternative is freezing to death in a forest far from home. Dawn in winter warfare didn't bring warmth, not immediately, but it brought light, and light brought hope. The sun rising over frozen forests, over snow-covered fields, over the ruins of war, meant you'd survived another night. That mattered. That counted. The first movements of morning were careful, almost ritual. Fingers and toes had to be checked, circulation verified. Extremities numb from cold needed gentle reawakening, not sudden activity that could damage tissue. Veterans moved slowly, methodically, giving their bodies time to transition from survival mode to function mode. The shelter halves were carefully folded, checked for damage from ice and cold. Any tears noted, marked for repair when time allowed. These pieces of canvas had kept them alive. They deserved respect and care. Soldiers would brush snow from the fabric, shake off ice, fold them precisely. The routine was part of the transition from night to day, from endurance to action. Footwear received intense attention. Boots were checked for moisture, for any signs that feet had been compromised during the night. Socks were changed if dry ones were available, or at least rotated. The damp pair moved to an inner layer to dry from body heat, while a less damp pair went against the skin. This morning routine, mundane as it seems, was where discipline showed most clearly. Soldiers who rushed through it, who neglected the small checks and adjustments, paid the price in accumulated damage over days and weeks. Those who maintained the discipline, even when exhausted, even when the routine felt pointless, kept their bodies functional. There's an account from a medic serving with the 2nd Infantry Division. He wrote about the morning inspections he'd conduct, checking feet, checking hands, looking for the early signs of cold injury. He could predict with uncomfortable accuracy which soldiers would become casualties, not from enemy action, but from their own neglect of morning discipline. The soldiers who survived winter warfare intact were often those who treated the morning routine with the same seriousness they treated weapons maintenance. Your body was your primary tool, more important than any rifle or piece of equipment. Maintaining it required attention, discipline, consistency. Movement in the morning was crucial, but had to be gradual. Muscles stiffened by cold couldn't be forced into immediate action without risk of injury. The practice was to move slowly at first, gentle stretching, low-intensity activity, gradually increasing as circulation improved and warmth returned to the tissues. Some units practiced group calisthenics at first light, not for fitness in the traditional sense, but for warmth generation and injury prevention. The shared activity also built morale, created a sense of collective resilience. We survived the night together, and now we're moving into the day together. Food, when available, became crucial in the morning. The body's caloric reserves, depleted by a night of shivering and thermoregulation, needed replenishment. Hot food, even just hot water, provided not just calories but warmth, a core temperature boost that helped the body recover from the night's stress. But often food was cold rations, frozen solid, requiring body heat to thaw before consumption. Soldiers would tuck ration cans into their clothes, letting body warmth slowly soften the contents. It was uncomfortable having frozen cans against your ribs, but it was the only way to make the food edible. The Germans, when supply lines allowed, received ersatz coffee, a poor substitute for real coffee, but hot and providing some psychological comfort. The ritual of a hot drink, even a terrible hot drink, marked the transition from night survival mode to day combat mode. Soviet soldiers had their morning tea strong and sweet when sugar was available, bitter and hot when it wasn't. The tea was often the first thing prepared, water boiled over small fires, built from whatever combustible material could be found. The warmth of the cup in hands was as valuable as the warmth of the liquid inside. American soldiers received instant coffee, a new technology in World War II, mixed with hot water when that was possible, or sometimes just chewed as powder when it wasn't. The caffeine helped, gave a small boost of energy to exhausted bodies, but more than that, it was familiar, a taste of home in a landscape that felt utterly alien. As morning progressed, as the sun climbed higher, its warmth, even the weak winter sun, began to make a difference. Soldiers would position themselves to catch sunlight, turning like plants toward that source of heat. Any patch of sun became precious, sought after, fought over in the friendly competition of cold men seeking warmth. The psychological shift from night to day was profound. Night was endurance, passive survival. Day was activity, purpose, the continuation of the war effort. But that shift required energy, required calories, required a body that hadn't been too damaged by the cold to function. Units that maintained discipline in their winter routines remained combat effective. Units that let discipline slip saw their effectiveness degrade, not through casualties, but through accumulated exhaustion, through the slow erosion of function that came from too many cold nights without proper recovery. Officers learned to judge their unit's condition not by combat performance, but by morning routines. Soldiers who moved briskly, who performed their morning checks without prompting, who maintained their gear with care, these were soldiers who could still fight. Soldiers who moved slowly, who neglected maintenance, who showed the 1,000-yard stare of deep exhaustion, these needed rest before they could be committed to action. But rest was a luxury rarely afforded. The war continued regardless of human limits. So soldiers pushed through, maintained discipline as best they could, and survived one more day to face one more night. There's a philosophical depth to these morning-after routines that the soldiers themselves might not have articulated, but certainly understood. Each dawn was a small resurrection, a return from the edge of something final. The routines, the checks, the careful movements, these were affirmations of life, declarations that they would continue, that cold wouldn't claim them. The knowledge they'd accumulated, the techniques they'd refined, became more than just survival tactics. They became a kind of wisdom, hard-won and precious. Knowledge written in the only way that really matters, written in survival, in the simple fact of still being alive when so many weren't. So what do we take from all this? What's the lesson that reaches across the decades from those frozen foxholes to wherever you are right now, listening in warmth and safety? It's not about the gear. That's the first thing. Modern equipment is better, no question. We have synthetic insulations that work when wet. We have vapor barrier liners. We have ground pads made of closed cell foam that insulate better than anything those soldiers had. We have knowledge encoded in product design. But gear can fail. Gear can be lost. You can find yourself in a situation where you don't have what you plan to have. And when that happens, when you're stripped down to basics, the principles remain. Heat loss happens in predictable ways, through conduction, convection, radiation, evaporation. If you understand the mechanisms, you can fight them with whatever materials you have. A garbage bag can be a vapor barrier. Newspaper can be insulation. Your own body position can reduce surface area. Knowledge weighs nothing and can't be taken from you. The second lesson is about moisture management. Wet kills in cold. That's not metaphor, it's physics. Evaporative cooling will drain your body heat faster than almost anything else, so you stay dry. You change out of damp clothes even when it feels insane to undress in freezing temperatures. You wring out your socks and dry them against your body. You manage every drop of moisture like it's a threat, because it is. Third lesson, the ground is the enemy. People think about cold air, about wind chill, about the temperature. But conductive heat loss through the ground is patient, relentless, and it takes your heat whether you notice or not. Ground before air. That became a maxim. Insulate yourself from the ground before you worry about the air temperature. A man lying on frozen earth in still air will succumb to hypothermia faster than a man elevated off the ground in a stiff wind. The gear you carry matters less than the knowledge you carry. This became almost a mantra among veterans. New replacements would arrive, their packs stuffed with everything the supply sergeant could issue, and the old-timers would shake their heads. "You'll learn," they'd say. "Give it a month. You'll learn what actually keeps you breathing." And tonight, as you settle into whatever warmth you have, consider for a moment the luxury of that warmth. Consider how recently in human history such comfort became common. How many of our ancestors, how many soldiers in living memory knew cold in ways we never will. There's gratitude in that consideration. Not guilt, but recognition. We stand on the accumulated wisdom of those who survived hardship. Their lessons, their techniques, their knowledge form part of the foundation of our comfortable present. As you drift towards sleep tonight, wrapped in warmth, secure in shelter, remember that these comforts are not universal, not even in our own time. There are people tonight facing cold, facing darkness, facing the same ancient challenges those soldiers faced. Perhaps our understanding of their techniques, our appreciation of their wisdom, can inform how we help, how we prepare, how we face our own challenges. The story of winter survival in World War II isn't just history. It's a testament to human adaptability, to the power of shared knowledge, to the strength we find in supporting each other through harsh conditions. Those lessons remain relevant, remain powerful, remain worthy of remembering. So sleep well, knowing that if ever you face such challenges, the wisdom exists. The techniques have been proven, the knowledge has been preserved. And in preserving it, we honor those who learned it the hardest way, who paid for it with suffering and cold, and nights that stretch toward infinity. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Thank you for listening to these stories, for keeping these memories alive. In remembering, we ensure that the lessons learned, the wisdom, gained, the resilience, demonstrated, all of it continues. All of it matters. All of it remains part of our collective human knowledge. Rest now. Let the warmth hold you. Let sleep come gently. And if you wake in the night feeling a chill, remember those who mastered cold through understanding, who survived through knowledge, who taught us that even the harshest conditions can be endured with the right wisdom and the right companions. Good night.